Uh, Good evening and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method you select, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 30 or so minutes of questions and then go and end promptly at 9 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I mentioned, we have a YouTube channel now. Please see the icon at the top of the website to access the channel. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at www.iidf.org. Now to this evening's speaker, and someone I've actually been trying to get for years on this program. Grant Harward is at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. He's a former Fulbright Scholar and a former research fellow at the Mandel Center of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. This evening, he's going to speak about his book, Romania's Holy War, Soldiers' Motivation in the Holocaust, which addresses the widespread myth that Romania was a reluctant member of the Axis during World War II. I have to say the reviews, not surprisingly, are top shelf, and there are a number of them. I'll just read out one or two. First, from the Journal of Military History, Grant Harward compellingly and convincingly shows that the Romanian Army was a conscious and dedicated partner of Germany in their joint campaign against the Soviet state. The four pillars of the Romanian officers' and soldiers' unwavering commitment to the dictator Ion Antonescu's Holy War were nationalism, religion, antisemitism, and anticommunism. While the Michigan War Studies Review notes Romania's Holy War presents an engaging overview of the Romanian Army from its origins to World War II, including a very useful sketch of its operational history. It's a stimulating and welcome addition to the scant body of English language historiography on Hitler's Axis partners in Europe. And then finally, I will call out the Second World War II research group. I know Jadwiga generally joins our talk, so I want to cite her review as well. Grant Harward's impressive debut monograph breaks important new ground by examining what motivated the conduct of Romanian army troops in this undertaking. Romania's Holy War is a valuable, pioneering, and highly impressive addition to the literature. It successfully and innovatively integrates Holocaust history with an examination of Romanian troops' motives and also benefits greatly from a highly engaging style and an effective use of visual sources. I think I'm done embarrassing Grant, and with that, I will turn it over to him.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you everyone else who's coming in to listen to me speak about my book. This title I chose today, Why Antonescu, or subtitle, Why Antonescu's Soldiers Fought, was actually a title I toyed with during my writing process. It didn't really fly because I don't think enough people, doesn't have the ring of like why Hitler's soldiers fought or Stalin's soldiers fought. But I just kind of highlight this because this book is often kind of portrayed sometimes as in the review literature, especially in the Romanian edition, as being kind of a Holocaust book. And this book really, at its core, is a book about the Army as an institution and as individuals, and trying to pierce that understanding of the motivation of the hundreds of thousands of Romanian soldiers who fought and committed atrocities on the Eastern Front. The Holocaust plays a big role in this, unfortunately, because the Romanian Army was deeply implicated. But I want to kind of put that first and foremost, that this is a book about the Army, about the perpetrators, about fighters, about, the soldiers, less so than kind of a Holocaust book. So now this isn't going to move. There it is. Just a little background on me and how I got to this position, because a lot of people wonder. So my first interaction with Romania was as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I served my mission there from 2005 to 2007 when I was 19 to 21. And before that time, I had no clue about Romania, no kind of understanding. But I'd already had a long love for history, especially was really fascinated with the history of the Second World War. And thus, after learning the Romanian language, about the Romanian people, Um, I very kind of once I returned to Brigham Young University, I decided to direct my study, direct my passion in history with this new language into study of Romania during the Second World War, and I was pleased to discover, that there was just a gaping chasm in the historiography, in English especially, but even in Romanian, as I went forward with that. And so I kind of started that, and I worked with my master's degree looking at stereotypes. I wrote that of the Romanian Army, kind of trying to understand what we thought about the Romanian Army in the West. And then my PhD, I wanted to work on the reality, the actuality. Um, and originally, my idea was kind of do more of an experiential kind of what was the experience of Romanian soldiers, how did it compare, on the Eastern Front. But luckily, I applied for to do my PhD at Texas A&M University, working with Dr. Roger Rees, and he wrote a book called "Why Stalin Soldiers Fought." So, a combination of working with him and also doing interviews, as I'll talk about, with Romanian veterans, uh, changed direction from being a book, a PhD about experience of Romanian experience of the war, and actually looking at why they fought, and also committed atrocities. So I just want to talk a little bit about the source base for this. So I worked in many Romanian archives. There's the National Archives, a lot of the upper echelon, the kind of Antonescu, the Romanian dictator, his military cabinet records are there. So the Ministry of National Defense records are there in Bucharest. But I also worked uh, in other archives, smaller archives, and bigger archives, including the CNSAS, which is the Council for the Study of the National Council for the Study of the Securitate archives. So you have a lot of secret police archives from the communist era that actually pulled in records from the Siguranța, which was the Royal Secret Police. So these are I kind of looked at reports on events during the war that were investigated afterwards by the communists. Also, like generals who were tailed during the war by the Siguranța and then later by the Securitate. It was really interesting to go in and look into individual records on different generals and how they were. Some of them basically they had kind of blackmail that they collected on them from their time during the war, which was interesting to use. I went into Pitești, which is a small city outside, a couple hours outside of Bucharest, but it has a giant archive. It's the main military archives there. I spent there a year there on a Fulbright scholarship, going through Army records, Army level records for the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, which were the two armies that fought on the Eastern Front, and also looking at Corps level records. I couldn't look at every Corps, but I looked at a number of Corps that were important: the Mountain Corps, Cavalry Corps, and a few others that I was able to kind of get to Army and Corps level records. So you can kind of understand a bit that my perspective here is kind of trying to look at the Army at writ large, rather than doing kind of a microhistory or a focus study on a certain regiment or division. Or another important source was diaries, memoirs. There's been more and more that have been being published in Romanian, and especially soldier memoirs that are really important that haven't come through. We don't have pretty much any of these translated into English. There's what Romanian materials have been translated into English are mostly produced by Romanian Jews. Mihail Sebastian's famous journal covering 1933 to 1944, and also several others. Some of those materials have made it, but I there really are no kind of wartime diaries of soldiers that have been translated. There's a few exiles, whether the Romanian Baptists or ethnic German Romanians who ended up in the West who write in English. There's a handful of those, and some memoir literature that way. But really, this was something that in my book I really tried to bring and translate little snippets from as many different diaries and memoirs as I could to bring soldier voices. I wanted this to be a book that focused on the Romanian soldier, that got into their individual stories, and also tried to create an image of the kind of total psyche of the Romanian army, which so often has been kind of misrepresented or hand waved or dealt with stereotypes. I mean, before my book, Mark Axworthy's book in English is pretty much the only other study, and it's a very kind of dry operational and technical history. Very, very good for what it is, but there's very little of the soldier voices, and it also kind of repeats a series of narratives that kind of present the war as Antonescu's war, as pretty much him the only one who believed in it, not even the officer corps really being on board, that they really want to fight Hungary rather than the Soviets. And so I really made an effort to try to get as much soldier voices. And also, in addition, I have a couple examples here of a soldier newspaper in the bottom left, and also a publication for chaplains in the upper right, trying to put in the propaganda, try to show what was kind of the milieu of being that these soldiers were living in, what they're being told, what they're imbibing of during this battle, this whole supposed holy war. And I also did oral histories with about 40 different veterans. The picture I have there, Konstantin Mihalcha, I think he was 96, I think, when I interviewed him. Probably the oldest person I interviewed, or definitely the oldest, who actually had been in every part of the war. He was part of the retreat from Bessarabia in 1940 when they withdrew, when that territory was ceded to the Soviets. He participated in the Eastern Campaign and survived. I think he even, if I remember right, then fought in the Western Campaign. And so I used those. They're very valuable to be able to ask them my questions. There was a lot of work done in kind of the 90s and early 2000s to do oral histories with veterans that have been transcribed, but a lot of those weren't really as relevant towards what kind of probing questions I wanted to. So it was really valuable to really be among to talk to these veterans before they're gone. I mean, we're looking at a handful nowadays. So moving on, I mean, this is where I think most people, when they encounter Romania during in the histories of the Second World War, this is what they think about. PLO, right? Petroleum, oil, and lubricants. It's the oil fields. This is a American photograph with target markings of Ploiești, of the city and some of the refineries. And kind of part of I mentioned this a little bit in my book. My book is to really get into more than this, just this aspect of the oil. I think oftentimes especially for an English audience, it's oil, it's tidal wave, and maybe that's about it. And I'm hoping with my talk tonight, and then if you go and read my book, you're going to find out there was a much bigger story here, a much more interesting story that about Romania during the war than just the fight for Hitler's oil, or kind of cliche. Geography plays a really important part for Romania's value to the Axis. I mean, the oil is really a strategically important source. It's something like a third of Nazi Germany's oil comes from Romania. A huge proportion of oil going to fascist Italy comes from Romania, and there's actually competition between the two and grabbing those oil and the agriculture. But as you can see in these maps, the one on the left from 1941, and the one on the right from 1944, you can see that Romania protrudes. It offers an important base of operations for the invasion of the Soviet Union, base operations for aircraft. You have a Black Sea coast. This offers important strategic and operational capabilities and options that other countries don't have in this region. And also in 1944, you see that Romanian, it really blocks the Soviets, and as long as they hold on by 1944, it's really important to be able to maintain German domination of Southeast Europe and a connection to other trade routes, especially with Turkey. Turkish chromium was hugely important, and also other materials that were being transported by ship and rail through that area. So Romania has like a geographic space, in addition to the oil, at certain times in the certain parts of the war, is really important on the Eastern Front. Getting into what I'm talking about, the armed forces, I think this is something that really overlooked. I mean, we always talk about the oil, maybe talk about some, when Romania switches sides, how much of a disaster that is, because it does lead to the collapse of German position in southeastern Europe. But Romania has a population about 20 million. Unlike Hungary, unlike Bulgaria, it was a victor in the First World War under the League system. It didn't have any restrictions, so it had a relatively large, well-trained army, with a relatively large base of reserves, relatively large aircraft industry. So I mean, during the war, you have upwards of 800,000 soldiers in the Romanian army, with about half of that on the front at various times. 400,000, 460,000, I think, is the peak in 1942 during Case Blue. Although at times you have over 1 million soldiers mobilized for the Romanian army in defense of the country in 1940, in 1939, and 1944. But you also have this relatively hundreds of aircraft, mostly scout reconnaissance types, but also a locally produced fighter, and they've also purchased a variety of kind of German, British, and French, Italian bombers for offensive action becoming useful, and then the fighters are useful for trying to stave off the Americans when they come after the oil later in 43 and 44. And then lastly, a modest fleet, but still one that's important to allow the access something. It's about 4 modern carriers, 2 of them new, destroyers. So 2 modern destroyers, 2 of World War I vintage, and then they have 1 submarine and a slew of like minesweepers and frigates and torpedo boats. And this is very little compared to the large Black Sea fleet, but it still gives the Germans options. I mean, this is a really important force that is fully committed. I mean, compared to, let's say, the Finns. I mean, the Finns, I think, in 1941 might be mobilized more people, but they begin demobilizing relatively quickly by August, where the Romanians are mobilized as many as they can. They go far deep into the Soviet Union, into Ukraine, into Crimea. You have some demobilization during the winter time of 40, but then by 42 you have another huge contribution. And in 43, when almost all the other, we're looking at Italy or Hungary, if they've been knocked out, Romania is maintaining 100,000 troops and then remobilizes in 44. It's a massive contribution to the Eastern Front. It gets lost in the giant kind of cataclysmic battles going on there. But which is really easy to happen because of this huge Nazi Soviet war. But the Romanians play a really big role in the southern flank. When we're looking at the other contributions, the Italians provide a corps, then 1 army in 42. The Hungarians something similar. I guess another important thing for geography-wise, Romania basically is a base of operations and logistics for the Italian Expeditionary Corps, later Army in Russia. Is really it's getting a lot of its supplies from Romania itself. So another kind of added aspect of Romania's contribution. All this is to say is, a lot of the usual narrative about the Romanian army is how reluctant it was and of being a part of the Axis. But when you look at these basic facts about how large of a contribution it made, how deep it went, how enthusiastic it was, and continuing fighting in Stalingrad and into the Kuban and Crimea and remobilizing in 44. This is not an unmotivated army. And also, as I was doing my research, the other aspect of my research was adding in the Holocaust. This is also another area where these claims in the traditional historiography of Romanian soldiers being unmotivated don't match up with how deeply implicated the Romanian army was in the Holocaust, carrying out its own, Romania carried out its own policies. Romanian soldiers were involved. They collaborated with the Germans. They also prosecuted their own atrocities in places like Odessa. You have a massacre of over 10,000 Jews, the Yash pogrom, and beyond. This is a little bit of a kind of a dig at somebody here, but when Timmy Snyder, I saw this in his book about the Bloodlands, a little pet peeve of mine that if you look down there along the Romanian border, the area of northern Bukovina and Bessarabia is not marked in the Bloodlands. Yet these areas experience very similar violence. Jews, 150,000 or so, were deported. Those are the ones that were. This is after the army goes through, and there's tens of thousands murdered by Romanian soldiers, with some collaboration with Germans. There's a SS Einsatzgruppen attached to the Romanian and German forces down there. There's two Romanian armies, the 3rd and 4th, and the German 11th Army, creating Army Group Antonescu, a fourth forgotten army group in the invasion of 1941. It disbands after about a month or so of fighting, but for that time, but it gets assigned an SS unit, which Antonescu allows to kind of roam. But most of the atrocities being committed there are by the Romanians who claim this territory. And then, once again, Romanians are actually participating in atrocities beyond just those borders. If I have a map here of part of Romania, part of Ukraine that was de facto annexed. They never actually annexed it because they didn't want to give up claims to northern Transylvania, which had been ceded to the Hungarians. But for all intents and purposes, Antonescu said that this area was to be treated as if it was going to be annexed to Romania. And while there were some carve-outs for the Germans, especially the SS, who had control over ethnic German towns and villages in Transnistria, the area between the Dniester and Bug rivers was an area that was under Romanian administration. It came under Romanian civilian administration. It became a dumping ground for Jews from Romania. The Jews the Soviet Jews who were there suffered terribly, killed in many tens of thousands, and various massacres in Odessa, Golta County, Bogdanovka, Butchichev, which was mostly done by SS, local ethnic Germans organized by the SS, but due to policies also prosecuted by the Romanian authorities. And this is something my book adds to, because it's not just about the Holocaust. A lot of Romanian Holocaust books focus just on this geographic area that we're looking at, the geographic area that either was part of Romania or under Romanian administration, Transnistria. And they don't go farther than the Bug. They don't go farther east. For my book, because I'm looking at the army and where it goes through into southern Ukraine, a lot of places that we hear in the news today, Mariupol, Nikopol, Nikolaev, Crimea, the Romanian soldiers are really involved in one way or the other in supporting the Germans. They actually are kind of given a secondary role. The Germans want to make sure, make clear to the Romanians, once you get across the Bug, the anti-Jewish policy is the SS. But that doesn't stop the Romanians from participating. And at certain times, in extremists, the Germans rely on them, especially, let's say, after the Soviet landings in the winter of '41 in Crimea. Romanian soldiers participate in retaking cities, and which the Germans have tried to been keeping the Romanians out of the cities because they want to loot them first. But when they have to rely on the Romanian soldiers to retake certain port cities, Romanian soldiers get involved and initiate massacres of local Jews, which are labeled as partisans. That's another thing my book looks at, is not just the Holocaust of Jews, but looking at the Romanian army's own part in the terrible anti-partisan warfare, which it quickly adopted on its own through its own for its own reasons. It wasn't just repeating or piggybacking off of the Germans. That very clearly in the very first days. I mean, even when they're liberating Bessarabia, there is a kind of an attack on partisans, franctireurs, as they're referred to at that point, later on adopting the partisan language of the Germans a few months later. So I want to, incorporate the fact that the Romanian army was committing atrocities, not just against Jews, but also civilians, partisans, and Soviet prisoners of war, although not to the extent at all as with the mass murder of Soviet prisoners of war conducted by the Germans. Although the Romanians turned over lots of their Soviet prisoners of war to the Germans, knowing kind of the treatment that was going on there. Anyway, so kind of getting to the meat and potatoes of my book is looking at the motivation, kind of understanding once I had this understanding, like, these don't seem like unmotivated people. They're participating in the Holocaust. The Romanians committed all these soldiers. A lot of the writings of since the 90s have been basically to extol the heroism of all the Romanian, the contribution, importance of the Romanian army's contribution. A lot of the military historians have been pushing that. But when you add in the Holocaust aspect, you realize, okay, well, we can't just celebrate this because they're also very motivated, not just to fight, but to commit atrocities. So what is motivating them? But that's taken as just assumed by both military historians who see the Romanians as fighting for God, king, and country, and Holocaust historians who just saw Romanian soldiers as anti-Semites and greedy. I mean, it's just it's just assumed that they're going to be motivated, whether in fighting communism or committing atrocity against Jews. And my effort was to actually put these together and show that the Romanian soldiers were actually very motivated, not just in 1941, but also throughout the rest of the war. I used John Lynn's, the revolutionary Napoleonic scholar, his tripartite definition of motivation, breaking up into initial, joining up, reporting for conscription motivation, sustaining motivation, enduring soldier life on the front, all the bad things, and then combat, the greatest test, combat motivation. I then also added the idea of atrocity motivation because that many of the things that we talk about that motivate soldiers spill over from beyond just the battlefield into the rear, into committing atrocities. I thought it was really important to kind of put that all together because then we can understand, have a full view of what the Romanian army was doing. It wasn't just fighting. It wasn't just enthusiastic, trying to just support the Nazis and defeating the Soviet Union. It was also very much supporting and carrying out its own ethnic cleansing, the cleansing of the terrain in Bessarabia and Bukovina, and then lending a hand in the final solution in German-occupied areas. So my book also looks at morale, which I think is really interesting. John Lynn has a great definition, which I kind of didn't use because I think problematically everyone has their own definitions. And when we look at morale reports, most from the period, they are not really referring to any kind of academic definition of the term. And I really liked Alexander Watson when he's looking at he was looking at morale in the First World War on the Western Front. He basically says that morale is a shorthand for sustaining motivation and combat motivation, kind of put together. When you read it in reports, that's really what it's being used as. And so I was able to, look at as many Romanian, reports that were looking, because they were very concerned, because we have this idea now that they were unmotivated, and commanders at the time were worried about it. So I found it really interesting. So, that these are the officers who are going to know their men the best, and so you often will find reports on morale. So I could get down sometimes to the divisional level because of these army level, corps level records I was looking at. You would get kind of reports up from below, and so I would, so I haven't been able to get down to like kind of regimental level, but I was able to look at divisional, corps, army level reports on morale at different times of the war. And whereas usually kind of just saying, oh, the morale drops off immediately after they cross the Dniester, after they've liberated Bessarabia, even just reading, that's just not true. I mean, there's no questions about that, and I think can tell like the Bug or the Dnieper River when there's all of a sudden some indications of, well, maybe we're worried about it, but that's in part because the Germans told the Romanians they weren't needed anymore. We're all going to go home, and then the Romanian soldiers find out actually the campaign isn't won. We got to keep fighting. So I mean, there's going to be some morale issues there. But I think that the issue of morale is kind of transitory. It can be good one day, bad another day. It changes from unit to unit. So even my kind of conclusions are relatively general, and I think there needs a lot more work in this because every division or corps is going to be a bit different. But overall, I mean, the morale I think was a lot better. But more importantly, the motivation, the understanding of what the war was about was very, very strong. And that's based on normative understanding, this idea of, fighting for the nation, and this ideology of holy war, which I see as focused on four things: nationalism, religion, and particularly Romanian Orthodoxy. But my book also has a chapter on minorities and women, but looking at minorities, including ethnic minorities, which often are also religious minorities, whether you're ethnic Germans who are Lutheran or whether you're ethnic Hungarians who are Catholic, but also religious minorities such as there was a small but growing population of Protestants, Baptists, Adventists, and even like a small Muslim population. So a lot of these groups, other Christian groups, even Muslim groups, could get behind this holy war rhetoric, which I found very interesting in my research. But also antisemitism and anticommunism. That these aspects, these all come out of the Romanian interwar society. It's a peasant society, so it's conservative leading already. You have a rise of fascism because these ideologies are so strong in Romania. There's fertile ground for the rise of fascism, and there even are some fascists, although they're repressed. They're briefly in power in 1941. They get repressed by the military government, but a lot of them are able to remain, or at least are sympathizers. So, there are fascists as well amongst all this. But I think kind of the point of my book is that you don't need Romania to be a fascist state for it to get along very well with Nazi Germany, have many of their ideas dovetailing as they're fighting against this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism. That's very, very powerful. That motivates soldiers to fight beyond just regaining territory, which is how it's usually presented. Oh, they did back in Bessarabia, they're no longer motivated. But this ignores these wider ideological understandings and the propaganda which reinforces them and is successful because this is already in the ranks. That whether you're, a bourgeois reserve officer or a poor peasant private, or you're like from a boyar family, you can all understand and all get together that fighting and defeating this barbaric threat from the east of Judeo-Bolshevism is worth it and is important. You're part of something bigger than just fighting for Bessarabia. You're part of this kind of climatic, apocalyptic clash of civilization versus barbarity. Western Christian civilization led by, in the words of one propagandist, led the apostle Adolf Hitler against barbarism, Oriental, Asiatic, Jewish communism. And this is, you find this all over the place. It just permeates. It's in diaries. It's in of course, in the propaganda. But this old idea that kind of only Antonescu was convinced about the war in the East really doesn't hold water once you start really getting into the evidence. That's all intrinsic. I also talked about extrinsic motivation. As much as important as ideology is, there were other things. The Romanian army was a fairly coercive. I mean, every army is coercive. I mean, every army is going to be a mixture of normative, kind of ideological discipline and a remuneration reward. So the Romanian army used flogging, reintroduced flogging during the war, mostly for all kinds of infractions. It was not uncommon for soldiers to be executed, especially for repeated desertion and self-mutilation. I have a picture I found of a frontline execution. I wouldn't say that it was as brutal as the Soviets or the Nazis, but it was you have hundreds of soldiers being shot during, which is nothing like what the Allies, would have Allied armies would have tolerated. So there is a fair amount of coercion there that we have to keep track of and understand. But also what motivation, right? This more in the sustaining, motivation category. This is to maintain discipline, kind of punish certain behaviors, but not really in combat. You can't whip soldiers and force them to fight, in this modern battlefield. And you really, this isn't what's motivating them to commit atrocities, other than maybe the fact that they could get beaten if they don't follow an order to murder Jews. But in general, those different motivations, this coercion has different times and different amounts of impact, and whether it's initial, sustaining, combat, or atrocity motivation. I also look at remuneration, whether it's medals. There's also plans to grant land, especially in reclaimed areas like Bessarabia and Bukovina, to decorated veterans. So there's a promise that soldiers will get land. Looting. I mean, there was extensive looting. Some soldiers were able to try to make a private profit as they crossed into even liberated territory. Bessarabia, there's actually complaints by Antonescu about how much Romanian soldiers, strip property that really belongs to the state, and was, stealing it and sending it back to back home. And then also using looting further on in Transnistria and beyond. And even complaints by officers saying, we are out on the front, we're fighting, and Jews who are back in Bucharest, who haven't been deported, but they're having their property expropriated, right? These officers are complaining that they don't have a chance. While they are the heroes risking their lives on the front, you cowardly people, or nefarious businessmen, they're reaping the benefits of expropriating Jewish property in Bucharest or other areas. So there's even the idea of, setting aside expropriated Jewish property for the heroes of the front. So there's a very direct kind of connection there between fighting this holy war, and that's against a real threat, the Red Army, but also this fifth column supposed threat of Jews that they're connected in the Romanian mind. But finally, so I got to stop, is kind of looking at self-interest. And as I said before, I tried to get soldier voices. Let's talk kind of in generalities in my book. I think, describing these ideology of holy war gives you an understanding of kind of the baseline worldview of Romanian soldiers, of what legitimized what they were doing. But that doesn't mean every single soldier was a rabid anti-Semite or was, saw themselves as a crusader, or that even if they did, that they, didn't want to protect their own life and hide or find some other thing to do when combat came around, or that when it was time to execute Jews if some didn't participate. But so this is one of my aspects of trying to get all these soldier voices. You understand the differences, that there are some that get involved for for various reasons. Every individual is still there. Maybe it gets lost a little bit in my book that focuses on kind of the big picture, but it was something I was trying to do to make sure that we remember that this is an army of soldiers, of hundreds of thousands of men. Each one is individual, but they kind of were within this wider worldview that for them is what, kind of how they understood what they were doing and motivated them to be actually quite committed to fighting. And so that we don't see a breakdown in morale and motivation during the big winter offensive in 41. The Romanian soldiers continue, that Romania is able to remobilize for 42, that Romania keeps fighting, having soldiers in the Kuban bridgehead in Crimea in 43, and even remobilized once again in 44 with a general mobilization to try to protect the homeland one more time. I think it's really important to not forget this individual within these big arguments I'm making about the army. And with that, I will open up to questions.
Hey, thank you, Graham. That was quite thorough and thoughtful and sobering. There's a number of questions in the queue. Maybe I'll take a few and then I'll go to the open mic. The first one asks, there's some questions about archivals here. Did you find anything in your research that overturned your earlier assumptions about Romanian motives or command structure?
I mean, it was interesting. My mom, a month or two ago, sent me a paper that I'd written that basically was repeating the old line. So basically, when I started this, I didn't go in here thinking, oh, these guys got to be motivated. I actually have papers written from, I think, my master's about talking about Romanian soldiers weren't that motivated, and the motivation fell off. So actually, the big change is that me going in and talking to these soldiers and reading the propaganda is, why this is a kind of a very different view. Like I used to hold, I kind of accepted that old view, and that's why I was going, oh, that's been written. I'm going to write a book about like kind of the experiences of soldiers. And then I realized, actually, as I'm getting into this and talking to veterans, that they actually seem a lot more motivated, a lot more committed, and that made me kind of go down that path to, all right, actually, this isn't a book about the experience, Romanian experience of World War II. This is we're getting like why these guys fought, why they committed atrocities. Sorry, what's the second part?
Oh, the second part was about yeah, basically anything that overturned your assumptions about Romanian motives or the command structure.
Oh, the command structure. Yeah, it's interesting to me that so much of Romanian military history that I read is focused on operations, when really that's like they ceded that. I mean, the big strategic decision that Antonescu made was to pile on with Nazi Germany, and thereafter the Romanians really they cede most of their operational control to the Germans. At some point, I mean, Romanian Third Army gets kind of turned into an administrative headquarters, and the corps get assigned to German 11th Army. So I mean, you maybe have like some kind of divisional and corps levels that are still doing operations, and then Army once in a while, once it gets big enough. But really, the big major operational level decisions are being made by the Germans. So it's kind of interesting to, as I was going in there, to understand that, and kind of it's just like there's this weird lack of understanding where they want to write kind of operational history in a lot of the Romanian military histories, but that's, to me, like that's where they had the least amount of kind of independence. Maybe if you get lower down to regimental and stuff, but no one's written on like kind of that aspect, the tactical aspect of the war. Even in Romanian, there's very little about how the actual war was actually fought. They want to like talk about the operational level and
Yeah.
then kind of snipe at the Germans and say, hey, the Germans let us down at Stalingrad. When, I mean, the Germans really were kind of scraping the, they didn't have anything to give the Romanians to
Yeah.
make that go any better.
This question actually, I think, is a nice segue. How much autonomy did the Romanian officers have in carrying out anti-Jewish operations?
So especially in the beginning of the very first days, they had a lot of autonomy. The basic, because these territories, northern Bukovina and Bessarabia, which have been lost, were very clearly in the Romanian sphere of influence, right? So the German 11th Army was under Army Group Antonescu, at least titularly, like, really like the German commander von Schubert kind of had his own thing. But like even the SS group, Einsatzgruppe a day that was there, it was there at the kind of the pleasure of the Romanians. And it was very, it was a smaller than the other ones. So it's only like 300 or 400. And so they're kind of running around to major population centers trying to like kill Jews their way. They would say, oh, the Romanians are so disorganized that you need to shoot these Jews. Well, so there's lots of, so in that early area, the Romanians kind of can do whatever they want. With the Germans kind of influence things here and there a little bit. Transnistria gets signed over to the Iranians, so something similar happens there. where that area is given to the Romanians. The Jews fall under the Romanians, and so the Odessa is one of the few big cities that falls through the Romanians, and they massacre on their own volition. There's very few Germans in the city when that massacre takes over. But once you cross into the Bug, into what becomes Reichskommissariat Ukraine later on, the Germans make it very clear, hey, this is Jewish policy here is assigned to the SS. Now, I've still found plenty of like reports of Romanian soldiers, fighting partisans, aka shooting Jews, but they at some points they had to like turn over Jewish hostages that they had taken and give them to the Germans in like Mariupol or other places like that. And the Germans have this policy of really kind of trying to, they use the Romanians as much as they can in combat, and then once you get close to a city like Sevastopol, you try to keep them out and not let them get in. And then the Germans will go in, they get the loot, and then the SS does most of the killing. Like I said, certain times that doesn't work out. They need the Romanians. So there's kind of this, as you go farther east, the Germans try to like kind of maintain what they want to do. But especially early on, the Romanians can do pretty much whatever they want because these are territories that they're quote unquote liberating. So they can do whatever they want to those Jews.
I'll ask, so there's a few questions about your archival research, but a follow-up to that, one question is, were there examples of resistance to the German orders regarding treatment of the Jews?
No, because these orders were coming, like, in the early days, you have even orders coming from the Antonescu, his government, that's called the Curățenie Terenului, meaning clearing the terrain. It's actually a military term in Romanian, basically kind of like clear and hold. But they use that as a term to basically gather Jews who survived into ghettos and then deport. So if you don't, so there are gendarmes, militarized police that come up behind the Romanian army. They have legit open orders, like you are supposed to, like whatever Jews survive the army coming through in these kind of wild shootings, kind of Holocaust by bullets. Then the gendarmes come when they have orders, explicit orders to round up whatever Jews are left, shoot some of them, and if you don't shoot them, you deport them. So so those are coming from your own administration. They had meetings of gendarme officers. They had like 3 of them right before the invasion, and so yeah, I mean resistance. And once you get to there you can find some examples but like Romanian soldiers having to fight against their own authority, and you can find some examples of a Romanian soldier who fell in love with a Jewish woman in Odessa. They tried to like get her out of there before she was murdered, and he gets arrested, she gets arrested, and so like there's very infrequently do we see things, but there's the mayor, he's a reservist of Odessa. He's from Bessarabia, so he's a dual speaker. He speaks Russian and Romanian. He tries to kind of, but not out of any love for the Jews, he tries to stop the pogrom because he just sees the city getting destroyed. He wants to say, hey, let's have order. This isn't making us look good to the locals. So there are people who resist. There are people who more likely they just don't participate. It's kind of ordinary men, right? Where it's less likely to resist and more likely you hang back. You don't join one of the death squads that they form in 41. You try to like stay away. But as resistance, not much to when like your general says, hey, we're in Nikopol, and the Germans are saying we have to hand over all of our Jewish hostages that we've taken. Most soldiers, they don't care. They already see the Jews as connected to partisans, and they'll just, some of them get bribed, and the Germans are like, oh, they're all corrupt. But German soldiers took bribes and stuff like that too. But there's this idea that the Romanian soldiers are more corrupt and took bribes. That's not really resistance per se. If you're willing to get, maybe you're a bit more susceptible to taking bribes from local Jews to look the other way, to let them escape or kind of join the partisans or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. A few more questions here. One is, any documentation regarding the Romanian casualty rate?
Yeah, I didn't look. I would refer to Mark Axworthy's book. He's probably got the best numbers on that. It depends on the campaign. It's pretty low in the beginning. Odessa has a spike. There's something like 90,000 casualties out of an army of something like 300,000 plus soldiers who eventually fight there. And so like 90,000 of them are um, killed, wounded, or missing. About a third of those are killed. So it's this, and he has, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but Mark Axworthy, if you want to actually know about, I don't get too much into the kind of the percentages there, but overall, I mean, there's a learning curve. Romanian Army doesn't it um, the fourth army that goes to Odessa takes relatively high casualties. The third army that is smaller has better troops. It's like mountain troops, cavalry troops, and it's like constant. It's not being thrown into a siege. It takes lighter casualties. It doesn't take really serious casualties in Crimea. I mean, they're complaining by the winter when there's the Soviet counteroffensive that they're having, companies down to, 60 guys or something. Like there is but that's because they're not getting enough reinforcement. So there's issues there of manpower shortages and everything. But like I said, I think Mark Axworthy's book, if you want those details, you go look there.
Excellent. Another question on your research: what sources prove most difficult to access, and how reliable were post-Romanian or Soviet accounts?
I
I know.
mean, the military archives were kind of hard, but just logistically wise, because they're in Pitești, they're not in Bucharest, they're on a military base, and so they don't allow, unlike the central archives, which are kind of with the times, where they let you bring in a laptop and camera, and when you go to the Pitești archives, they are kind of old school. They don't allow cameras because it's a military facility. They don't allow laptops. And so just kind of like logistically, I had to like write out longhand, and they were only open from like 8 to 2 Monday through Thursday. And that's really why I needed like the Fulbright. There was some of those records had been put on microfilm and were in Bucharest, but you didn't know what the communists left out.
Mm.
And that's why I wanted to go to Pitești so I could look at everything. And so it just, that was just kind of time consuming because of those restrictions. But getting in, I mean, I wrote a letter, they got me in. I mean, it was not really difficult to like get in much more than any other one. I mean, the archives there are actually pretty open. The secret police archives, the Communist secret police archives, they've done a really great job of people are really interested in that stuff, and it's pretty accessible. And even dealing with issues of privacy of people who are still alive who might be in those archives. So Romania, like it's not like Russia where they were opened up and they clamped back down. In Romania, you've kind of had a continual opening up, and most of the archives are really open. There was some recent changes, but from what it's into the law, but from what I understand, it really didn't restrict things as much as some people feared at the time. But my experience with the archives was basically you could access most of anything you wanted.
A follow-up question: did you have access to Soviet military records regarding Romanian activity? I think you just answered that, but
yeah, I mean, I don't speak Russian, so I didn't use as many of those. I also don't think the Russian sources are going to be as valuable because a lot of their records are going to be like interviewing soldiers who were captured,
no.
and it's going to be through their ideological lens. I use German liaison records. We have a lot of that, and so my German's better, and there's been more of that translated. And I also think, and as I point out in my book, the Germans have the ability that the Romanians are their allies, so they're getting pretty good information, unlike the Soviets, where you're the enemy, right? So your view of the enemy is a little bit skewed. And at the same time, the German view of the Romanians are sort of skewed through professional and racial biases. But the Germans have all these other allies, right? The Finns, the Hungarians, the Italians, Slovaks. So you can understand something about the Romanians by reading what the Germans had to say about them in comparison to all the others. And which is what the Germans say, basically, the Romanians are the most motivated in combat and in helping us murder Jews. I mean, they stand out. Like if you read Richard DiNardo's book about Germany and the Axis powers. He does a really good job of kind of coalescing this, and he repeated that the Romanians always kind of stand out as being more motivated both on the front and more committed to the Holocaust, the final solution.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Brian asked, again, I think you answered this. What did the Germans and Italians think of the Romanian army's ability to conduct operations? How professional, how organized were they?
The Germans are relatively dismissive of the Romanians' abilities to conduct operations, but at the same time, their kind of view is, hey, if Romanian soldiers are hardy, if they only had good leadership, you meaning us, the Germans, right? But I mean, the Romanians officer corps is decent enough, and you have enough German. I think the Germans are kind of supercharge. You get enough liaison officers, they can get a lot of our work done. I think it's pretty impressive. But yeah, the Romanians are a step or two below logistically and operationally, and they're not as qualified as there's not just racial issues here. The professional standards were lower, so some of the German arrogance towards the Romanians is merited that the Romanians weren't as well. Their officer corps wasn't as good, but it wasn't, I think, as terrible as kind of the stereotypes lead them up to be.
Excellent. That concludes our our talk for this evening. Again, thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. The book is Romania's Holy Wars, Soldiers' Motivation and the Holocaust by Grant T. Harward. Please join us next Tuesday, November 3rd at 8 p.m. when historian and World War II discussion forum former speaker Mark Stille will discuss his latest book, Pearl Harbor, Japan's Greatest Disaster, which argues that the Japanese attack was, instead of a brilliant strike as conventionally portrayed, was in fact a tactical disappointment, an operational failure, and a strategic disaster. Hopefully you can join us. Finally, I want to acknowledge the passing of Canadian World War II historian Tim Cook, who served as chief historian at the Canadian War Museum and was widely regarded as the country's preeminent military historian. At least from my perspective, he was a first-rate scholar, and we corresponded on several occasions, and he really brought clarity, humanity, and depth to Canada's wartime story, and he will be sorely missed. Our thoughts and prayers are with his family, friends, and colleagues. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next week at our talk. Thank you, and Grant, thanks for a great talk.
Thank you for the invitation.
Take care.